Okay, hi everybody. My name is Jim Craig. I'm the president of the Veteran Studies Association, and thank you very much for coming to our colloquium, our first one for spring 24. Let me just take a quick second to talk to you about VSA if you're not already a member. Think about joining. The Veteran Studies Association promotes and publishes rigorous scholarship about critical issues shaping veterans' experiences. And we think about those experiences in any country and any historical area, and the purpose of doing that really is to enhance public understanding, teaching service and advocacy in this space. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you, please think about coming to the Veteran Studies Association conference. We call it Veterans in Society. It's just a month away, or a little over a month away, on March 14th and 15th at the University of South Carolina. It's going to be a beautiful venue. I have seen, actually I have it here somewhere, I have the presenter list, and it is fantastic. Having been to, I think I'm on to the next hand now of Veterans in Society conferences. I think this is going to be the best one. It's really an impressive group of people, an impressive group of topics. If you are interested, just head to our website, veteranology.org, and then find the conference thing and hit register here, and we would love to see you. With that plug complete, I'm going to pass the baton to Corinne. Corinne organized this, so thank you very much, and I'll let you do the introductions.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, hi everybody. I'm Corinne Hinton, Dean of English and Humanities at Lincoln Land Community College and Secretary for the Veterans Studies Association. It's my honor today to introduce you all to our special guest colloquium series speaker, Jocelyn Chua, who is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, not too far from where our Veterans in Society conference will be taking place. Trained as a medical anthropologist, she uses qualitative ethnographic methods to understand the social, political, and economic dimensions of health, illness, and well-being. Her current research that is funded by the National Science Foundation and Wenner-Gren Foundation is a cultural and historical analysis of the rise of psychopharmaceutical use by the U.S. Army in the global war on terror. She is the author of In Pursuit of the Good Life, Aspirational and Suicide in Globalizing South India from the University of California Press, 2014. Again, Jocelyn, thank you and welcome, and we're happy to have you here. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation to present with the VSA. I've been an avid follower of all the important work the VSA has been doing over the last decade. So to be able to share my research with the group is really especially meaningful. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've just got a few slides, though I promise no death by PowerPoint. Okay. I assume that's visible to everyone. Great, thank you. So as Corinne noted, I am a medical anthropologist, which means that I use qualitative methods to understand the social, political, and historical dimensions of health, illness, and well-being. I primarily use ethnographic methods, including ethnographic observation, semi-structured interviews, and focus groups to illuminate the complexities and nuances of human experience in relation to health and medicine. In addition to being a medical anthropologist, I'm also a civilian with a family member in the Army National Guard and a civilian academic interested in collaborative possibilities in social science research with military-affiliated students and student veterans. And the research that I share with you today emerges out of a multi-year project that has involved the training and collaboration of undergraduate military-affiliated students and student veteran researchers at UNC Chapel Hill, my home institution. These students have been involved at various stages of data collection, analysis, and dissemination as part of a broader effort supported by an NSF grant to train undergraduate students in qualitative social science methods. So I want to thank them for their contributions to various aspects of the project that I'm sharing today. Today's talk draws on research examining the turn to the use of psychopharmaceuticals among deployed U.S. military personnel during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And just to give a brief background, in 2005, a study reported that almost 80,000 American military personnel, that's 7.7%, sent to Iraq or Afghanistan since 2002 had had a psychiatric diagnosis before their first combat deployment. Because prior mental disorders are a known risk factor for maladaptive responses to stress and for PTSD, the in-theater vulnerability of military personnel with a previous diagnosis became an issue of significant interest to the DoD. In response to this finding, the U.S. Department of Defense established a policy in 2006 which developed for the first time official criteria for the use of FDA-approved psychiatric medications in theater, heralding what may become a revolutionized role for the use of these medications in the practice of U.S. military operational psychiatry. Reported prescription trends are suggestive of this revolution. The period between 2005 and 2011 saw a 682% increase in the number of psychotropic drugs prescribed to U.S. troops. And during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was estimated that at least 1 in 6 active duty service members was on some form of psychiatric medication. Psychoactive medication by military service members has been a highly controversial topic. Media accounts, for example, have been highly critical of the quote-unquote drugging of our soldiers, as one journalist terms it. Media accounts have positioned soldiers' psychopharmaceutical use as a sign of any number of concerns, among them the biological exploitation of soldiers and the inadequacy of the U.S. military response to mental health issues. And here I'm just sharing a sampling of headlines, and you can see how the topic itself leads to certain kinds of tropes in these headlines, particularly around the pairing of pills and weapons, sometimes in very moralizing and sensationalized ways. Psychopharmacy use on the battlefield has also been a contentious issue within the U.S. military medical community. Much of this controversy has stemmed directly from a proposed correlation between the increase in psychiatric medication use and the increase in suicide rates during periods of the global war on terror. Skeptics have also warned that the safety of medications in combat, including SSRIs, has simply not been proven. While acknowledging the importance of these debates, in this talk, my aim is not to rehash them. Rather, I advocate for ethnographic understanding of how U.S. military service members and veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have themselves experienced and interpreted psychotropic drug treatment in war. Our study has documented a diverse range of stances on the use of psychopharmaceuticals on the counterinsurgency battlefield, from enthusiastic support to ambivalence to staunch resistance. Soldiers and officers theorized the significance of the use of psychopharmaceuticals from the grounds of their everyday experiences in deployment and the day-to-day practicalities and risks of specific occupational specialties, operational demands, and infrastructural realities that varied widely for individuals and their timing and location of deployment. As a medical anthropologist, I lean into what qualitative methods and ethnographic description can enable us to see that quantitative data and investigative journalism can often miss, foregrounding the diverse and complex situated experiences and embodied insights of deployed military personnel. So my talk is organized as follows. I'll first briefly introduce the research project. I'll then give a short historical overview to highlight why the turn to the use of these medications in deployment can be understood as a rather revolutionary turn, even as these medications are imminently familiar to U.S. civilian life. This will be followed by a brief discussion of the limited official data we have of psychopharmaceutical use in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, after which I'll devote the remainder and bulk of the talk to walking us through some of the operational, social, and political complexities of psychopharmaceutical use in post-9/11 counterinsurgency. I draw on research conducted primarily in North Carolina with over 130 study participants. All participants at the time of the interview were U.S. Army active duty, National Guard or Reserve, or a veteran of the U.S. Army. All had deployed either to Iraq or Afghanistan or both following the events of September 11th, 2001. All had either personally used medication they considered to be psychoactive in nature or had closely observed the use and effects of psychoactive medication by a peer. We also interviewed several military healthcare providers who were responsible for initiating and maintaining prescriptions in deployment. Most of our interlocutors were enlisted rank at the time of interview, or in the case of veterans, when they left the military. The vast majority were serving or had served active duty. The vast majority were also conventional Army, with about 10% having had some experience in special forces. since the goal of the research was to understand the diverse ways these medications are accessed, used, and experienced across different occupational specialties, locations and timing of deployment, and military rank, we aim to get wide representation across these multiple criteria. And then this slide shows some deployment data across our study participant sample, including earliest and most recent deployments. Average number of deployments to Iraq or Afghanistan was 1.77, with the highest number of deployments to Iraq or Afghanistan for a single study participant being 7, and the highest number of overseas deployments anywhere for a single study participant being 11. While the standard use of psychiatric medications in theaters is a relatively new development for U.S. military mental and behavioral health care, the use of chemical substances in war is, of course, not new. Scholars have offered sweeping histories looking at the relationships between war and psychoactive substances and the ways authorized and unauthorized chemicals have long been used to enhance performance and ease injury and boredom among soldiers at war. In ancient Greece and later ancient Rome, daily rations of alcohol helped to boost morale and courage among troops. Natural and synthetic stimulants and sleep aids have featured critically in the global race to develop drugs that will effectively counter fatigue and improve performance. The Vietnam War, called the first pharmacological war, would see for the first time in military history the use of modern psychopharmacy in combat. And more recently, the therapeutic potentials of psychedelics like psilocybin have attracted the attention of military and veteran communities. The use of psychopharmaceuticals in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan may appear as yet another chapter in a long history of the synergies between chemicals and war. There's also the fact that American life is saturated with psychopharmaceuticals. The number of psycho or neuroactive medications being prescribed in the US is historically unprecedented, garnering cataclysmic descriptions like Pharmageddon. In 2020, more than 252 million prescriptions were written for psychiatric medication, with medications for ADHD constituting over a third of prescriptions that year. Polypharmacy, defined as the ingesting of 2 or more psychiatric medications daily, has become a social and medical fact for millions of patients. Given both the proliferation of psychopharmaceuticals in American life and the history of the use of psychoactive substances in war, the turn to psychopharmaceuticals in the global war on terror may come as little surprise. Yet, when viewed from the perspective of modern military psychiatry, the psychopharmaceutical solution is in fact not an obvious one. Military psychiatric orthodoxy throughout the 20th century normalized combat stress as an expected response to war best treated through the principles of forward psychiatry first developed in World War I. These principles emphasize non-pathological treatment as close to the front lines as possible to maximize the likelihood of soldiers' return to duty. Treatment was limited to sedation, sleep, food, insulin for weight gain, occupational therapy, and physical training. Patients wore their uniform throughout their treatment to keep focus on the military role, and the aim was to quickly return the soldier to combat, offering only short-term relief. Medicalized treatment for combat stress responses was strictly discouraged, as treatment of the soldier as patient was understood to foster malingering and unnecessary medical evacuation. Standard use of medications was to be avoided. While U.S. military interest in psychopharmacy during combat first arose during the Vietnam era, it quickly fell out of favor following the war out of concern for the unknown long-term psychological effects of medicating stress reactions in combat. While sentiment began to shift in the 1990s with the development of so-called cleaner psychiatric drugs, namely SSRIs, as recently as the late 1990s, the U.S. Army's Combat Stress Control Field Manual continued to emphasize non-pharmacologic interventions on the understanding that effective soldiers rely on their own capacities, not pharmaceutical crutches, to rebound on the battlefield. That tide has since shifted, and the shift has signaled many things, among them profound historical transformations in the cultural and political significance of soldier mental suffering in the United States since the Vietnam War, and the move away from forward psychiatry's near singular focus on combat stress to the contemporary expectation to provide comprehensive, full-spectrum mental and behavioral health on the battlefield. To date, most of the research on psychopharmaceutical use among U.S. military personnel has largely focused on the use of these medications before and following deployments. DoD record keeping on the distribution and use of these medications in theater has historically been lacking and likely underreports use of medications. The few published studies on the topic offer glimpses into official prescription rates. In one large study describing prescribed treatments by mental health providers for over 1,300 treatment-seeking military personnel deployed to Iraq, medication was the most prescribed treatment, but was often combined with recommendations for counseling and/or behavioral modifications. Medications were prescribed for 41% of clients diagnosed with a mental health condition, with antidepressants as the drug type most frequently recommended across all diagnostic categories. Another study of soldiers assigned to a brigade combat team in Iraq suggests that SSRIs came second to sleep aids as the most prescribed medications. Benzodiazepines were prescribed, though rarely for short-term management of acute anxiety. Reliable data on psychopharmaceutical use among military personnel in deployment is also limited because these medications are often prescribed outside of mental and behavioral health encounters. Data from the Defense Health Board, for example, reports that 70% of all antidepressants prescribed in the military are prescribed by primary healthcare physicians. Moreover, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, psychopharmaceuticals were rarely accessed in fixed locations and could circulate through informal practices that escaped regulation. They can also circulate along official and unofficial channels as they are consumed, shared, experimented with, and traded. Research has shown that in-theater providers usually see patients with general complaints related to sleep, depression, and anxiety, so their efforts are focused on symptom management rather than diagnosis, contributing to irregular documentation practices. The challenge of tracking these medications is related in no small portion to the practical and material dimensions of their use. Compact, portable, and requiring only water to consume, medications have moved with relative ease across the material, geographic, and tactical terrain of counterinsurgency operations. Pills travel well in bottles and Ziploc baggies, therapy less so. It is precisely this mobility and ease of circulation, the ability of medications to provide help in place to soldiers, that proponents have advocated for their use in theater. Andrew, for his part, attributes his ability to finish out his tour in Afghanistan to the bottle of pills that reached him at that remote combat outpost where he was stationed in the Korangal Valley. Andrew recalls the day the doc showed up because Andrew immediately pulled him aside to chat over smoke. Quote, "He didn't smoke," Andrew would later tell me, "but he'd dip with you because he was a good guy like that." On his second deployment in 4 years, the first during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the infantryman was feeling rough around the edges. Every foot patrol, every interaction with a lieutenant who got under his skin had become a test in control. Andrew confided this all to the doc. He opened up, and in short course, the doc opened his rucksack. Quote, "Whereas the rest of us have ammo and water and food," Andrew tells me laughing, "he had a ruck full of pills. With the Celexa, it was just like, here's an energy drink and a cigarette. Just like, oh, hold on, try this. Same thing," end quote. In Andrew's case, the Celexa never made it into his medical record. After all, quote, "it was literally on the side of a mountain in Afghanistan." The doc placed a 3-month supply of pills in Andrew's hand and wished him luck. Andrew tells me years later in our interview that the doc had done a good thing. Quote, "He was basically like a medic, tasked with keeping people in the fight, but on the mental side of the game, not bullet holes, right?" And the doc did just that. It was the very mobility of psychopharmaceuticals that enabled help in place for Andrew. Yet his account also highlights the practical limitations of documentation and tracking, and the challenges of comprehensive medication review and documentation in theater. The variability of medical documentation practices raises clinical challenges, including those related to polypharmacy, such as potential medication contraindication, drug interactions, and overlapping prescriptions. And this has been particularly relevant for the Army, which continues to lead all other military branches in the polypharmacy use of psychotropics, central nervous system depressant medications, and opioids. There were other practical limits complicating the use of psychopharmaceuticals in theater shared by our interlocutors, including the challenges of supply and concerns for withdrawal. About a week into its deployment in Iraq, Corporal Bay ran out of his anti-anxiety medication he had taken for years. The 25-year-old had been called up so quickly to deploy that there hadn't been enough lead time to arrange to bring with him a bulk supply of his medication through his Army provider. So when it was time to go, Bay told me he kissed his wife and newborn goodbye and left for Iraq with the 9 pills he had on hand. The day his bottle of propranolol no longer made its telltale rattle, Bay panicked, but figured nothing could be done. At the time, he was located at a small combat outpost where it was clear he stood little to no chance of getting a refill, so he didn't even try. Mind and body quickly rebelled. Within days of his medication running out, Bay told me he was waking up in the mornings, imagining worst-case scenarios of IED blasts and his wife and son left on their own. Those early days without medication were a haze of what he described as constant catastrophizing and an ambient feeling of impending doom. Riding in convoys would cause his heart to race, quote, off the charts, a deeply unsettling feeling for Bay, who had had heart surgery a few years prior. At times, it felt as if his chest would break open. As a cavalry scout who traveled regularly on mounted missions, those moments now seemed to string the days together. When his unit was later moved to a larger installation with an aid station, Bay saw his chance. The aid station didn't stock propranolol, though, so there was none on hand. The PA put in an order to receive a supply through military mail pharmacy. In the meantime, personal relationships became key, and the young corporal took to showing his face every day at the aid station to see if the order had come in. Sometimes he'd bring the staff a pack of gum or cigarettes. Aware that the medics regularly traveled out to other installations, Bay eventually got friendly enough with a few of them to ask if they would try to snag some propranolol for him from the other aid stations, enough to tide him over until the full refill came through the mail. Despite Bay's diligent efforts to cultivate relations and ease flows, the pipeline stayed dry. Bay wouldn't come into any more propranolol until his prescription arrived through the mail, and by then, over 5 months had passed. Bay had just 2 weeks left before returning home. The irony that he pointed out to me was that the medication arrived in true Army bulk supply style, in the biggest bottle of medication Bay had ever laid his eyes on. In an apt culmination of his many months' dedicated visits, and to the genuine applause of all in the aid station, the medic ceremoniously handed off the propranolol to Bay in the oversized manufacturer's bottle, with the usual prescription label indicating his name and dosage without the usual prescription label, and full of hundreds of pills that he said ended up lasting him until well after his return home. My point in sharing Bay's story is not to merely point to logistical breakdowns, inevitable as they are in a war zone, but to underscore the embodied implications of these breakdowns and how a soldier like Bay must improvise in the gap. It also underscores what is perhaps an obvious, yet often overlooked fact that bears making explicit. Unlike vaccines or antibiotics, when used as chronic medications, psychopharmaceuticals require continuous supply, yet refills through mail order pharmacy could take weeks to months. And prescriptions for even chronic medications require a degree of flexibility, reflecting the dynamic and often episodic nature of mental health itself. Psychopharmaceutical use typically requires titration and other kinds of adjustments over time. A soldier might arrive in theater with a bulk supply of an SSRI they've been taking for years, only to find they have a reoccurrence or a worsening of symptoms that requires a dosage change or new prescription, which actually was a common presentation for soldiers deployed with medication during the wars. In other cases, they may not report their medication use as required by the Army before they leave station, and they deploy on an antidepressant different than the first or second line antidepressants stocked in the limited deployment formulary, only to run out while in theater. Running out posed different kinds of challenges for military healthcare providers, trying to treat and ensure adequate supplies for patients, challenges that provoked their own kinds of workarounds. For providers, there was no guarantee that deployed formularies included providers' preferred medications or the medications that patients were already on. Of those that were stocked, there were often limited amounts, requiring frugal dispensation tactics by providers until a mail order pharmacy prescription could be initiated. Even with the expanded deployment formularies, enhanced tracking of prescription requirements, and improved supply chains that would evolve years into the wars, medication stocks were often less robust or regular than providers expected, wished, or were accustomed to given how they practiced in garrison. This led several of our interlocutors to describe their work with psychopharmaceuticals in theater as a kind of craft or an art. The primary healthcare providers we spoke with, the vast majority of them physician assistants, conveyed a broad range of comfort levels with prescribing these medications in deployment. While some reported that what they called garden variety medications like first-line SSRIs were generally safe to prescribe downrange, others said that while they were fine to maintain soldiers on prescriptions they had been approved to deploy with, they largely avoided writing new psychopharmaceutical prescriptions as they felt it to be too risky and too challenging to provide follow-up care. Attitudes toward SSRIs were especially divergent. One combat medic responsible for monitoring 2 of his teammates who were returned to his remote outpost in Afghanistan on antidepressants referred to them as cupcake medications that raised few major concerns, while hesitant PAs expressed concern for suicidality and SSRI use among their young adult population. In general, switching or starting a soldier on a new psychopharmaceutical prescription required significant risk calculation and management on the part of healthcare providers. While guidelines around the use of these medications was clear, adapting them to the particular operating environment, especially if that environment were austere, required working in a gray zone. Because clinical evaluations of soldier stability is braided with manpower calculations and risk management, and because long-term psychopharmaceutical use introduced supply considerations and potential for withdrawal, all in contexts that could be continually shifting, prescribing psychopharmaceuticals demanded a very specific kind of clinical imagination on the part of care providers, the ability not only to understand the operational particularities of the environment and the soldier patient's role within that environment, but the ability to project across operational time and space how those things might shift in the near and far off future. As one PA explained it using a hypothetical scenario, quote, "It was up to me and the surgeons and psych to ask, can you do your job right here, right now? But also to ask, can you do your job when we close that DFAC in 3 months and we're all waking up at 4 a.m. to pull fire guard? Are you going to get worse when all this infrastructure disappears and you look out and say, oh, shoot, the only thing between me and the outside is that wall and the couple of guys in that tower? There's not a huge footprint of people and gunships here anymore. Are you going to get worse?" End quote. Some providers felt confident in their ability to risk manage based on current and anticipated scenarios, with one alluding to his well-developed spidey sense. Others emphasized that this was always a nervous and never settled process characterized by, as one PA unforgettably put it, a high pucker factor. I turn now to some of the embodied effects of medications some soldiers reported in deployment. In interviews, soldiers highlighted the situated and experiential ways that they theorized the risks, benefits, and side effects of psychopharmaceuticals from within the specific occupational and operational demands of their day-to-day. In doing so, they commonly reinterpreted and challenged the ways side effects and adverse reactions of medications are understood in civilian contexts. Consider Sarah. Sarah spent much of her second 15-month deployment in Iraq as she did her first, sitting in a highly secured SCIF base on base. A cryptologic linguist trained in Arabic, Sarah took Ritalin for the first time when it was given to her in Iraq. It came from a fellow specialist who had it prescribed to her by the Army for her ADHD and was willing to share. The Ritalin was something their small team would take together during surges, escalations of intelligence-led missions that required them to move from 8 to 12-hour shifts, which for Sarah took place at night. But it was hardly ideal. Use of a fellow soldier's prescription medication ate away at their teammates' supply, and the medication, Sarah told me, also had its significant drawbacks. Sarah said she had a hard time translating on Ritalin. Giving me a cursory introduction to the root and pattern system of the Arabic language, she described how meaning is encoded in the structure of words and how that structure is relational. Quote, "I feel like if you're halfway listening to somebody in Arabic, you are probably getting a better read than if you're trying to individually parse out each and every word," end quote. The kind of laser focus that Ritalin gave Sarah actually interfered, she said, with how the language needed her brain to work. While it got her through those interminable night shifts, it compromised her ability to translate. Sarah's reflections are important for many reasons. First, they highlight the role of informal psychopharmaceutical use in strategies of high-strung desperation, as she described them. Strategies of doing what you can with what you have for long enough to get you home so that you can deal with the repercussions later. Where force production and mission readiness are the goals, you do what you need to do and take care of what you can to get the job done, she tells me. But even more than this, Sarah theorized adverse effects in relation to the rather unique cognitive, linguistic, and operational demands of her work, specifically in relation to her ability to think in and translate Arabic, effects that defied generic clinical guidelines developed in civilian contexts. What side effects were for Sarah acquired meaning and significance only with respect to the specific capacities expected of her. I'd like to share with you one final account of medication side effects to briefly raise some potential ethical questions surrounding psychopharmaceutical use and deployment. I met Tanya in her apartment about 40 minutes outside of Fort Liberty on an unseasonably warm spring morning in 2019. She had miraculously coordinated our interview to coincide with her 8-month-old son's morning nap, and so once she had tucked him away in his crib, we sank into her plush living room couch and settled in to talk. The 33-year-old had left the military the year prior, having enlisted in the Army fresh out of high school. A 74D, chemical biological specialist, she deployed twice, once to Iraq in 2005 and again to Afghanistan in 2014. While in Iraq, Tanya decided to try to quit smoking and was prescribed the antidepressant medication bupropion, which is often used for smoking cessation. Soon after she began taking it, Tanya knew something was wrong. Quote, "I was having awful nightmares and cold sweats," she described to me. When she went back to the prescribing PA, she was told, "Well, do you want to quit smoking? Is that more important? Or are the nightmares more important? Which one?" She walked out of the appointment a bit reassured since the PA didn't seem unusually concerned. Maybe the nightmares were a normal part of adjusting to deployment. She had also heard that anti-malarial medications could cause nightmares. Maybe it was that. She decided to commit to sticking it out on the bupropion a bit longer, though she had her doubts. Quote, "I wanted to take care of my health and quit smoking, but I also didn't want to feel like I was going crazy." End quote. Thinking back on that conversation with the PA years later, Tanya wonders why the PA never offered to switch her to another medication. There was no, "Hey, you can try other things," or "That's not normal. That's the side effects," she said. Within days, things got worse. She recounted multiple episodes where she was seeing things in the pitch black of night. Rats running across the room that would make her dart out of her trailer. Her roommate told her again and again that nothing was there, but Tanya couldn't be convinced otherwise. It got to the point where Tanya decided to sleep in the command post. She worried it was the medication, but she worried even more that it wasn't. Quote, "At the time, I wondered if there was something really wrong with me, if it wasn't just the medication. Was I going crazy?" If seeing rats in her room was relatively benign, seeing things on the road during quick reaction force night driving was not. Quote, "It got really dangerous for me because I would see stuff on the road, animals, people. And I would stop in the middle of the road and my truck commander, he would be like, 'Why are you stopping?' And I'm like, 'There's something out there.' And he's like, 'There's nothing there. I need you to go. You have to drive.' And I'm like, 'There's something there.'" Years later, Tanya reflects, quote, "Trust is a big issue when you're deployed because you have to be able to trust the person beside you. So if the person beside me can't trust me, then I'm no good in deployment. I don't want anybody to feel like they couldn't trust me, but then again, I couldn't trust myself, so I didn't know what to do." Tanya's story is telling not only for the lesson it shares about the importance of patient education concerning potential side effects with medication use, but also because it underscores potential ethical questions that medication use can raise in cases of compromised soldier agency and accountability. Tanya reflected that she was extremely lucky something worse hadn't happened. Quote, "To be in a deployment and go through that, like my actions and non-reactions could have killed somebody. If you stop in the middle of the road because you see something that's not there, you're a ticking time bomb. Somebody can blow you up, somebody can take out your whole team and everybody behind you because you thought you saw something that wasn't there. And then I would have survived and I would have been responsible. I would be held responsible for that and I would have to live with it." At the time, Tanya wasn't sure who to turn to. Quote, "I didn't want people to think I was crazy and send me home. I didn't want to be a disappointment to my unit and get sent home. but I also didn't want anybody to really think I was crazy and then they don't want to be around you, end quote. A full month lapsed before Tanya was on the phone calling home when she finally confessed to her mother, a nurse, about what was happening, at which point her mother told her to pull herself off the medication. Tanya says that her symptoms ceased immediately. In this talk, I've introduced just a few of the complexities that psychopharmaceutical use has introduced for soldiers and healthcare providers in deployment. Pills may appear in one light to be a clear solution on the counterinsurgency battlefield. The mobility of these medications, the ease of their dispensability, make them a convenient therapeutic. Yet these same characteristics are also what can make them difficult to track and fluid in their circulations, including their shared or unofficial use, as we saw in Sarah's case. Polypharmacy can also complicate an already complex clinical picture, including with respect to mental and behavioral health on deployment, where military personnel are already adjusting to any number of operational, occupational, and interpersonal stressors that can confound distinctions between diagnosis and medication toxicity, as we saw in Tanya's case. But the difficulty of tracking medication use and polypharmacy in the wars can also be seen as indicative of the fluid ability of these medications to reach soldiers in need, like Andrew, who says getting medications on the side of that mountain is what enabled him to finish out his tour. Sarah's account prompts us to attend to how soldiers themselves experience, interpret, and theorize risk and benefit of medication use from within specific operational contexts. And finally, Tanya's account raises questions about the potential for psychotropic medications to undermine capacities that require soldiers to have morally responsible action, underscoring the challenges of patient education and follow-up in the deployment, the dynamic settings of deployment. Taken together, these accounts make clear that the use of psychopharmaceuticals implicates a broad universe that's not limited to clinicians and soldier patients, but also to include infrastructure, supply and logistics, the nature of specific operations, battlefield ethics and bioethics, and the corporate sociality of deployed military life. Keeping these many factors in our field of vision is critical if we are to study the impacts of this turn in military battlefield treatment. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Chua, thank you. Wow, that was that was a. I'm just going to open with some questions, I guess, to get it started. I think if you want to unshare your screen, we can see each other a little better. So my first reaction is that was a. This is a class I teach on this campus. That was a textbook use of qualitative methods to describe a social phenomenon, and I'm going to take the recording, I'm going to show it to my qual method students and say, this is how you do this work. So thank you very much for that. And second, my other thought is, how did you get a hold of the picture of the prescriptions that I got in theater? They looked just like that. So
I had many people
it brought back some good and some bad memories. So I know that this type of research isn't really supposed to draw anything but better understanding and deeper understanding of the experiences of these soldiers. But I also wonder, is there a way to take these experiences and then share them to policymakers, to leaders, and to, besides like think more deep about what you're doing, because this is the effects, but are there some changes we need to start thinking about or start addressing related to psychotropics and war?
That's a great question, and one that I continue to return to. I think, and this is a challenge in general, I think, and I speak from within the field of medical anthropology as someone who works primarily with qualitative methods, but is interested in questions that are deeply relevant to public health. And we are currently in a time where it's big data and it's aggregate data and it's interventions that can be scaled up to the population, right? That seem to speak more readily to those in public policy, for example. At the same time, as someone who works in qualitative methods, I continue to believe in the importance of nuancing these analyses with the stories of actual people, but it does mean that they're not generalizable, right? And so there's no way that I would want to claim that any of the stories or the accounts that I shared is somehow representative of all military personnel's experience on medication, because that's simply not the case. And so I think the place where there are potential possibilities for nuancing the conversation with this kind of data has to do with one, pushing back a little bit on the kinds of narratives that have circulated in mainstream media around psychiatric medication use and military mental health, and the kinds of tropes that I know many of you continue to analyze critically, right? The kinds of discourses that tend to dominate our understandings of what mental health looks like in the context of warfare. And so even being able to offer stories that start to diversify the kinds of stories that are typically represented within the mainstream media, I think is important, and potentially broadens our ability to ask different kinds of questions. And so I start partly from there as like, do we even presume we know what the questions are or should be? Right. Let alone what are the answers to those questions. As an anthropologist, I always come from the perspective of like, I want to hear what other people have to say as far as what they think are the important questions. And so I suppose I start from there. I don't think it lends itself very nicely at all to sort of actionable implementation. But I think just beginning from, first questioning, what is it that we need to study of this issue? And what are the questions that may be relevant is often a good place to start.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And this, it's always a good reminder that good qualitative work like this is not designed to be generalizable. It's designed to get a deeper understanding. But I think stories are really important, and the stories that you picked out, whether somebody who works in this field realizes it or not, it can affect their thinking, understanding how people they don't need to generalize it across their entire field, but this is how people experience this phenomenon. So I'm gonna shut up and open this for questions. And it is okay. We are an informal group. We're a small group. So just unmute yourself and speak away. But if you want to raise hands, I can do that call part too. Or if you're reticent, the chat also works.
So, thank you for the presentation. That was phenomenal. So I'm Curtis Adelman. I'm the incoming Director of Military and Veteran Operations at the Catholic University of America, currently running our Veterans Upward Bound program. I retired as a Navy Senior Chief, so E8, in August. And I'm curious, because a lot of your data, or a lot of what you were talking about, starts from like '06, and when we were really ramping up and still deep into the beginnings of what was a 20-year war. During my career, so I did 20 years, retired in August, and the narrative around mental health changed drastically over that time period. And I knew nothing about the ins and outs of it until I started experiencing things myself. So it took almost 4 years for me to get help and get to where I needed to be. So in my last role as a command senior chief, I kind of encouraged all of my sailors, whether junior or senior, if they were struggling, to go talk to somebody. And I still dealt with a lot of individuals who were afraid to do that because of the, oh, I'll lose my clearance, or I'll do blah, blah, blah. So my question, I guess, is how do we use this information and data to help change that narrative and illustrate that, yes, these are things we need to address and you need to do appropriately, but it's a proactive, not a reactive measure. So seeking out that support and help is actually a strength and a benefit to the individual and the unit. So I'm just curious if there's a way to tie what you've got into that.
It's a great set of observations and questions. Thank you, Curtis, for sharing that and for sharing something about your own career within the U.S. military. So I noticed something similar insofar as while officially the US military, and David Kieran, who's written about mental health in the context of the post 9/11 wars, has talked about how the US Army in particular really has promoted itself as trying to destigmatize mental health very actively during the conflicts. I would continue to hear from enlisted soldiers specifically who would say, yes, that is the official party line. But I personally would be really concerned about the same things you mentioned, Curtis, sort of losing security clearance. Stigma was a term that was used a lot, right? And everyone would say, well, you could seek mental health, but everyone would know where you were going. Because if you're going somewhere at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon at the same time, everybody knows that that's where you're headed. So the question of how do you change the narrative? And again, I'm drawing on insights from folks that we talked to who said, the way change can happen. And this was primarily coming from NCOs. They would say, we have to model that for our guys, right? Our soldiers, right? We've got to be able to not only potentially present our own vulnerabilities and to talk about our own experiences, we have to find ways to normalize this, right? Because stigma is a really real thing. Concerns about careers is a very real thing, right? Nobody should be sitting there saying, well, it's not going to happen because we don't know, right? But if you can normalize the ability to have conversations with your peers about it or with, NCOs you trust, the more you can model that possibility for others. One thing that we did find that is quite interesting because there is quite a bit of literature that says, stigma around mental health is persisting despite all these official attempts by the military to kind of normalize seeking help for mental health. We found that people were quite comfortable to talk about medication use. And part of that is that medication use isn't so clearly tied to mental health in ways that diagnoses are. And the fact that these medications are often being prescribed more loosely with respect to diagnoses suggests that there's space for people to kind of live with these different kinds of therapies and potentially how they might be associated with diagnoses in actually very open ways in deployment, in part because these are material things. And if all you have is one tiny drawer to lock your stuff away in when you're in deployment, people generally know when you're on medication, right? That's what people would say. And so they tend to live with it and they tend to know about it in the course of sort of the flow of deployment life. That is quite different than the discourse around stigma tends to represent, right? And so there's potentially an opportunity here for soldiers to engage questions of mental health, in part because they're seeing medications. They're potentially implicated in the medication use of their peers, right? So one of the reasons why we really made it a criteria to not only interview folks who said that they were prescribed these drugs, but also people who observed it, was because we wanted to get the corporate and sort of team aspects of like, how do you think about your teammates' medication use, right? Given the particular job you were doing, was this something that was of concern to you or not? How did it become part of how you thought about care for your comrade in arms, right? Your brothers, your sisters. And so I think, again, that's to Jim's point, right? Where kind of attention to ethnography and the attention to what does this actually look like in people's situated experiences, I think that can be helpful because it can, again, push back a little bit on this presumption that everything about mental health is stigmatizing. The way people live with medication suggests that there's also something else going on, at least with respect to medications. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I do have a follow on, but I don't want to take up every bit of time here. So one of the things that I always did was my calendar as the command senior guy was public. Everybody could view it. And I would put on my calendar a mental health appointment. I wouldn't put what was going on, but I would say I'm going out for a mental health appointment to try to illustrate, look, doesn't matter. You can go do your thing. But you're right, especially if it's a weekly thing. Yeah, hey, every Wednesday at 2, you're taking off. we know what this is. I was curious though, you said that the 7.7% were diagnosed before deployment. Oh, I just hung up on somebody. Whoops. Oh well. Didn't mean to do that. And is that data from like '06 and prior to? Because I'm curious just with the
Yeah.
kind of evolution of understanding mental health, understanding autism and different things, the number of people that are on the spectrum is significantly higher than what it would have been 30 years ago because we have a better understanding.
Right. That's an excellent point. So that study was looking at the time period of 2002 to 2005.
Okay.
But absolutely, and I think that's true of medication use too, right? So there's the absolute number increase, but there's also the fact that, these things are becoming in general more normalized and more ubiquitous in US civilian life, right? So the question always comes up, to what extent does this actually reflect something very specific to the military? And how much of it is a reflective of sort of general changing prescription and diagnostic patterns in US civilian life? And I think it's both, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's one or the other, but certainly, there have been arguments that have been made, including from within the US military medical community, that one of the main reasons why they had to turn to the use of psychiatric medications in deployment was because of the higher percentage of National Guard and Reserve that were deploying during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these folks in particular coming in with different ideas about medication use and different expectations around the provision of medication with respect to mental health. And so, a lot of the analyses of like, why did this happen when it happens is because of, the question of like, maybe they're bringing in new kinds of civilian expectations around medication use. And now we're needing to respond to that, especially in a deployed environment. Yeah. I should say, including in a deployed environment.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for the questions.
Anyone else out there? Well, we don't have to stand on some sort of time hack. So Dr. Chua, I want to just say thank you very much for your presentation, for your insights, for like bringing me right back to those experiences 15 years ago too. And we look forward to hearing more from you sometime soon. I hope, yeah, because this is really important and good and great work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and with that, for everybody else, we hope to see you at the conference. Remember, www.veteranology.org. If you're interested and you're not registered already, you can get there from that. And I look forward to seeing you hopefully most of you in person in about a month. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.